Hey all, we're going to do a couple of lectures on bones. So we're going to break this up into a couple different pieces. This first video we're going to talk about the structural anatomy of the bone and the microanatomy of the bone. And then the second one we'll talk about calcium regulation. So if you look at the skeleton's broke up into two different pieces. The skull, the vertebral column, the ribs, and the sternum. So this part of your skeleton. It's known as the axial skeleton. All of the other bones, the limb bones, so the shoulder bones and the arm bones, and then the pelvic bones and the leg bones, those are known as the appendicular skeleton. And there's several different kinds of bones that you find in the skeleton. We're not going to focus on all these. We're going to actually focus on some of these more than others. The ones that we're mostly going to talk about are these bones called long bones and these bones called flat bones. We'll also talk a little bit about short bones and irregular bones. Irregular bones are just like they sound. They don't have a regular shape to them. So your vertebrae, for example. And short bones are just like they sound. They're short. They're kind of cube-shaped. We are going to spend a lot of time looking at long bones and flat bones. And long bones is a little misnomer. Long bones are bones that are longer than they are wide. So in general, they have a shaft with two ends that are wide at each end. Flat bones are just like they sound. They're flat. So long bones, a good place where you'd find long bones would be your femur, for example. Your femur, I don't have one in front of me, but you can see here's a femur. It's got a wide end at the proximal end, a wide end at the distal end, and it's narrow in the middle. Flat bones are flat, and you find those, for example, in your skull. So your skull bones are flat, and we've started looking at those, but those are flat bones. Your sternum and your ribs are flat. Your pelvis, your scapulae are flat bones. So those are the bones that we're mostly going to talk about. Now, what do bones actually do? You probably think of bones, rightly so, as providing structure and protection, right? So you have a rib cage surrounding your heart and lungs. You have a skull surrounding the soft tissues that make up your brain. You have a vertebral column that helps protect your spinal cord. So you have this internal armor that's protecting you. And that's a really good way to think about it. You also have your bones providing structure and movement. So muscles pull against the bones and act as levers, and you can do this movement thing. They provide structure so you can hang organs off of them. But bones also do a couple of really other important things that we don't often think about. One of the really important things is store minerals. So the main mineral that you usually think about with bones, I know you're thinking about it right now, calcium. Calcium is stored in your bones, and calcium is used for lots of other stuff. We've already talked about this a little bit. Calcium is used, for example, to release neurotransmitters in the nervous system. Calcium is also needed to get muscles to contract. So any muscle that you have that you want to contract, you need calcium for that. If you want to keep your heart beating, you need calcium for that. So your bones are going to store that. The other thing that your bones do is they make blood cells. So all the kinds of blood cells you have are made in the bones. And we'll get into that a little bit more now and a little bit more later as well. So let's talk a little bit about what a bone looks like. And I'm going to use this example here of a long bone. I'm going to kind of zoom in here. All bones have this particular anatomy to them, in that the outer part of the bone is made of this dense material called compact bone. And there the bone material is packed really tightly together, and that's very strong and very dense and very heavy. The middle part of the bone, though, is not made of compact bone. The middle part of the bone is made of this stuff called spongy bone, and it looks just like it sounds. It's full of all these empty pockets and these little pieces of bone connecting them together. Now, in long bones, you'll also find a space in the shaft part of the long bone. That's called the medullary cavity. Now, in live bones, they're not empty. They're filled with marrow. We'll talk more about that shortly, but that's what those structures are. Now, in a long bone, and we're going to talk about this a lot, we actually have special names for the ends and the shaft part. So the ends, one end of the long bone is called an epiphysis. That's where the bone gets wider. That's the epiphysis. The shaft part of this is called the diaphysis. So the epiphysis is packed with spongy bone, and the diaphysis has some spongy bone, but it does have this space, this medullary cavity. Now bones, living tissue anyway, we won't be looking at any living tissue, even if we do face-to-face. Bones are also covered in membranes. So there's a sheet of connective tissue that covers the outside of the bone. That's called the periosteum. And then there's also a sheet of connective tissue that runs over all the spaces on the inside of the bone, including the medullary cavity. It's called the endosteum. And that's helping to provide some structure to the bone. It also anchors blood cells to that bone. Now, if you look at spongy bone, it's a little bit different. Spongy bone doesn't have a medullary cavity. Flat bones. Flat bones don't have a medullary cavity, they're flat. So instead, they have basically a sandwich of compact bone with spongy bone in the middle. Now, there are actually two kinds of marrow that you find in the bones. And you can see some here in the long bones in the medullary cavities of adults. You have yellow marrow. Yellow marrow is fat, so it's a place where we can store energy, which is another thing your skeletal system does. In the flat bones and in the diaphysis, particularly the proximal diaphysis of the femur and the humerus, you have red marrow. So red marrow in adults, it's in all of the spongy bone, and it's in the heads of the humerus and femur. The rest of the bones have yellow marrow in them. Now in infants, all of the spaces, the medullary cavities, all of the spaces have red marrow. Because the red marrow is churning out lots of blood, infants are growing really fast, they need that blood to grow. So red marrow is all the marrow that infants have. Now, microscopically, the bone looks kind of like this. So this is showing you a close-up of the diaphysis, say of the femur, and we're looking at what's known as the compact bone. And you can see the compact bone, if you look really closely, it's actually made of these ring-like structures. This ring-like structure is called an osteon. And if you remember looking back at tissues, that tree trunk structure, that's what you were seeing. So we pack a bunch of these together to make up the compact bone. An osteon is made of rings of calcified material. These are called concentric lamellae. And then there's a canal that runs through the middle. This is called the Haversian canal. And there are blood vessels that sit in there, as well as nerves. Now, if you look up really close, I'll zoom in here. In between the lamellae, you have these spaces here. So here are my lamellae, and you have these spaces. In those spaces, you have these structures that are called lacunae. So, lacunae. Lacunae, and lacunae means cave, is where these bone cells called osteocytes sit. You can also see here we have these stripes. It looks almost like tiger stripes. Those are called canaliculi, and those are where extensions of these osteocytes go out into the bone. Canaliculi means tiny canal. So you have these tiny canals connecting these spaces, the lacunae. And so these cells sit in the lacunae, they extend their membranes out into the bone material, and they help to maintain that bone material. Now the spongy bone is actually made of a very similar thing. It's made of these concentric rings. There's no central canal, but you do have these central rings, or these concentric rings with these lacunae, and you have these osteocytes, these bone cells within them.